June 18, 1944, Normandy. Morning mist hangs low over the bocage, clinging to hedgerows scarred by shell fire. A German Panzer officer stands beside his immobilized tank, boots sunk in wet soil, eyes fixed on the western horizon. The night's fighting has ended, but the silence brings no relief, only questions. Across the fields, American columns are already moving again. Trucks, hundreds of them, rolling forward without pause. Fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, mobile workshops, bulldozers clearing roads still warm from explosions. Where the German counterattack exhausted itself by dawn, the enemy appears renewed. The officer checks his map. The Americans should have slowed. Their beachheads were narrow, their supply lines exposed, their losses heavy. Instead, they are advancing. A damaged Sherman burns in the distance, abandoned without ceremony. Behind it, another replaces it, and another. The pattern is unmistakable. Loss does not interrupt momentum. It barely registers. This is not how German doctrine understands war. Battles are meant to decide outcomes. Attrition is meant to weaken resolve. But here, in Normandy, something else is at work. And as German tank commanders begin to compare notes, a quiet realization forms. This enemy is not constrained by the same limits. The shock is not tactical. It is structural. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had already passed its point of illusion. Germany had been fighting continuously for nearly 5 years. The victories of 1939 and 1940, Poland, France, the Low Countries, belonged to another era. They were campaigns shaped by speed, surprise, and concentrated force. But by June 1944, Germany was no longer fighting short wars. It was enduring one. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht had been locked in a struggle of exhaustion since Operation Barbarossa stalled outside Moscow in late 1941. Stalingrad had destroyed an entire army. Kursk had drained Germany's armored reserves. Every offensive now consumed equipment faster than it could be replaced. In the air, Allied bombing steadily eroded German industry. Ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, rail yards, and aircraft factories were struck again and again. Repairs were made, production resumed, but never without delay, improvisation, or loss of efficiency. Germany was still producing weapons, but it was doing so under pressure, fragmentation, and scarcity. Yet despite these strains, German commanders retained one critical belief. They believed that an Allied invasion of Western Europe, when it came, would be vulnerable. Normandy, in particular, appeared manageable on paper. The Atlantic Wall stretched along the coast, reinforced with bunkers, mines, obstacles, and artillery. German doctrine assumed that any large-scale amphibious landing would suffer catastrophic losses in its opening hours. Supplies would bottleneck on the beaches, vehicles would be trapped, units would fight isolated and disorganized before they could consolidate. German planners expected that armored counterattacks, launched quickly and decisively, could crush the invasion before it matured. This belief rested on experience. Amphibious operations were historically fragile. Even successful landings required delicate coordination between sea, air, and land forces. Any disruption, weather, enemy fire, or logistical miscalculation could unravel the entire effort. And Germany had one advantage it still trusted: armored warfare. The Panzer divisions stationed in France included experienced crews and formidable machines. Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs, though fewer in number, were technically superior to most Allied tanks. German tank commanders expected to exploit this advantage once Allied forces moved beyond the beaches and into open terrain. But this confidence concealed a growing blind spot. German doctrine understood how to fight battles. It did not fully grasp how the Americans intended to sustain them.
The German logistical system was designed for efficiency, not abundance. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were delivered precisely, rationed carefully, and consumed conservatively. Vehicles were repaired repeatedly, equipment was preserved, nothing was wasted. This approach had worked when Germany fought short, decisive campaigns. It struggled in wars of scale. By 1944, fuel shortages dictated operations. Training hours were cut, armored units conserved movement. Panzer divisions that appeared formidable on maps often lacked the fuel to maneuver freely. Repairs depended on cannibalization. Losses were felt immediately and permanently. American forces operated under a different logic. Their war effort had been mobilized years earlier. Shipyards, factories, and rail networks functioned as a single integrated system. Loss was anticipated. Replacement was planned in advance. Redundancy was not inefficiency, it was doctrine. But this difference was still abstract to many German officers before Normandy. On paper, German tanks outclassed Shermans. German crews were battle-hardened. German commanders had decades of armored warfare tradition behind them. What they had not yet confronted, at close range, was what happens when an enemy treats logistics not as support, but as the core weapon itself. That confrontation would come not in a single clash, but gradually, unmistakably, as German tank commanders began to meet an opponent whose strength did not diminish under pressure. And it would begin the moment Allied forces moved inland from the beaches.
When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, German commanders initially interpreted events through familiar frameworks. The beaches were chaotic. Paratroopers were scattered, some landing zones were missed, units arrived out of sequence. From a German perspective, this looked like the predictable disorder of an amphibious assault under fire. At Omaha Beach, resistance inflicted severe casualties. German officers monitoring early reports believed this was confirmation of long-held assumptions. The invasion was costly, it could still be broken. But within days, that interpretation began to fracture. What German tank commanders encountered inland was not an army struggling to organize itself, but one already expanding faster than resistance could compress it. By June 10th, Allied forces had landed over 300,000 men, tens of thousands of vehicles, and massive quantities of supplies. Beaches that should have been temporary footholds became functioning ports in all but name. Roads clogged not with retreating units, but with inbound columns of trucks, fuel tankers, engineering vehicles, and artillery. German aerial reconnaissance reported an unsettling pattern. Every day, the Allied logistical footprint grew denser. Temporary roads appeared where none had existed. Pontoon bridges spanned rivers within hours. Damaged equipment was cleared rapidly, not repaired on the spot, but replaced entirely. Vehicles destroyed by artillery were bypassed, not recovered. The flow did not pause. German tank commanders advancing toward the front began to notice something deeply unfamiliar. American units did not wait for resupply. They arrived already supplied. Fuel dumps appeared behind the lines faster than German intelligence could track them. Ammunition was expended freely. Artillery fired continuously, not in rationed barrages. When units took losses, replacements followed quickly, often with fresh equipment. This contradicted German operational logic. German armored doctrine assumed that pressure would exhaust an attacker's logistical tail. If supply lines were strained, movement slowed. If fuel ran low, operations paused. If equipment was damaged, units fought at reduced strength. None of this seemed to apply. German tank commanders reported engaging American units repeatedly, only to encounter the same formations days later, re-equipped, reinforced, and still advancing. The contrast became sharper with each engagement. German Panzer units conserved fuel carefully. Orders emphasized limited movement. Tanks were positioned defensively, waiting for decisive moments.
Training had conditioned commanders to think in terms of scarcity. American armored units maneuvered continuously. Sherman tanks advanced, withdrew, repositioned, and returned without visible hesitation. When tanks were lost, replacements arrived from rear depots that seemed impossibly close to the front. Crews dismounted without panic, confident that recovery or replacement would follow. Behind these movements was a logistical architecture German officers had never fully anticipated. The Red Ball Express, a massive round-the-clock trucking network, pushed supplies from Normandy beaches deep into France. Thousands of trucks moved fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts along dedicated routes. Drivers operated in shifts. Breakdowns were accepted as normal. Loads kept moving. German intelligence intercepted fragments of this system but could not disrupt it effectively. Air attacks failed to halt it. Sabotage achieved limited results. The system absorbed losses and adapted. For German tank commanders trained to exploit operational pauses, this was deeply unsettling. There were no pauses. Even when terrain favored defense, hedgerows, narrow lanes, villages, American units continued pressing forward, supported by artillery and air power that arrived on schedule. The battlefield no longer revolved around individual engagements. It revolved around momentum. And momentum was being generated far behind the front by fuel depots, repair facilities, transport units, and factories thousands of kilometers away. German officers began to realize that Normandy was not simply an invasion, it was a demonstration of what modern war looked like when logistics were treated not as a limitation, but as a weapon. This realization would shape how German tank commanders interpreted every clash that followed, setting the stage for a deeper reckoning that went beyond tactics and into the structure of warfare itself.
German tank commanders in Normandy were not amateurs. Most were veterans of Poland, France, the Balkans, and the Eastern Front. They had learned war under conditions of constraint. Fuel was limited. Spare parts were precious. Crews were trained to improvise, repair, and conserve. This shaped how they thought. A panzer commander measured success not just in enemy losses, but in whether his unit could still move tomorrow. Engines were nursed carefully. Tanks were hidden rather than repositioned unnecessarily. Every kilometer driven was a calculation. Against this mindset, American logistics appeared alien. German officers observed Sherman crews abandoning disabled tanks without panic. Crews dismounted calmly, sometimes under fire, knowing that recovery teams or replacements would follow. To German eyes, this bordered on recklessness, but it was underwritten by certainty. The certainty that supply would arrive. This altered the psychology of combat. German crews fought with the knowledge that each loss narrowed their future options. American crews fought knowing that loss was survivable. That difference mattered. It influenced aggression, risk tolerance, and morale. German commanders noticed American units pushing forward even after taking losses that would have forced German formations to consolidate or withdraw. The battlefield no longer rewarded careful husbandry alone. It rewarded continuity. German armored doctrine had always assumed that inflicting losses would slow or halt an enemy. Attrition created space. Space created opportunity. In Normandy, this assumption failed. German tank commanders reported destroying multiple Shermans in localized engagements, ambushes in bocage lanes, defensive stands near villages, sudden counterattacks against advancing columns. Tactically, many of these actions were successful. Operationally, they achieved little. Destroyed American tanks were replaced rapidly, units reorganized overnight, artillery support returned the next day, air cover reappeared. German officers began using a phrase that appeared repeatedly in reports and diaries: "The enemy returns unchanged." This was not exaggeration,
It was observation. Attrition, once a tool, had become irrelevant against an opponent whose replacement rate exceeded loss rate. German commanders understood the implication immediately. Tactical brilliance could no longer generate operational advantage. The battlefield had shifted from a contest of skill to a contest of systems. German tank commanders respected American equipment less for its design than for its availability. The Sherman tank was not feared as an individual vehicle. Its armor was thinner. Its gun was weaker than the Panther or Tiger. In direct engagements, German tanks often held the advantage, but the Sherman appeared everywhere. It was present at the front. It was present in reserve. It appeared after losses. It appeared in new units. It appeared with spare parts, fuel, recovery vehicles, and trained crews. German officers began to recognize that technology could not be evaluated in isolation. A tank that could be repaired, replaced, and supported continuously had greater operational value than a superior machine that could not. American logistics turned adequacy into dominance. This realization unsettled German commanders deeply because it challenged the foundations of their own doctrine. Doctrine built on excellence could not compete with a system built on abundance. And that understanding began to reshape how German tank commanders viewed every engagement, no longer as a chance to win decisively, but as another moment in a war whose outcome was being determined elsewhere. What shocked German tank commanders most was not that the Americans had supplies, but how deliberately those supplies were used to maintain pressure. American logistics did not merely support operations, they enabled constant operations. Fuel deliveries ensured armored thrusts did not pause. Ammunition stockpiles allowed artillery to fire without rationing. Spare parts kept vehicles operational at a pace German maintenance crews could not match. Medical evacuation and replacement systems returned wounded soldiers or replaced them without disrupting unit cohesion. To German officers, this meant the Americans were never forced into decisive pauses. Where German counterattacks depended on precise timing and dwindling resources, American advances flowed continuously. The enemy did not need perfect execution. The system compensated for error. German commanders began to understand that they were not fighting isolated armored units, but an integrated machine designed to sustain momentum indefinitely. The final shock was psychological. German tank crews fought with courage and discipline, but the awareness of imbalance crept in quietly. Each destroyed Sherman that was replaced overnight reinforced a sense of futility. Each fuel shortage that immobilized German armor deepened frustration. Confidence did not collapse dramatically, it eroded. Commanders began framing success in defensive terms: how long ground could be held, how much time could be bought, how many resources could be forced from the enemy before withdrawal became unavoidable. American logistics altered morale without firing a shot. They transformed the meaning of loss. For German tank commanders, Normandy revealed a truth they could not escape. The war was no longer about tactical superiority, it was about endurance. And endurance favored the side whose supply lines were limitless. That realization carried directly into the moments where battlefield shock hardened into irreversible outcome, where logistics met decision, and the turning point could no longer be delayed. By late July 1944, the illusion that Normandy could be stabilized had collapsed. German tank commanders no longer measured success by territory held, but by how long their formations could remain operational before fuel, ammunition, or mechanical failure forced withdrawal. The front had become elastic, bending not to tactical brilliance, but to supply pressure applied relentlessly from behind American lines. The decisive moment did not arrive as a single battle. It emerged as a condition. American logistics had reached critical mass. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, marked the point where German armored resistance began to unravel, not because of inferior fighting skill, but because the system supporting it could no longer respond. After weeks of attritional fighting in the bocage, American forces unleashed concentrated air and artillery power, followed immediately by armored exploitation. German tank commanders watching the breakout understood something immediately. This was not a gamble, it was an inevitability. American fuel dumps, ammunition depots, and replacement units had been prepared in advance. The breakout was not just an attack, it was the release of stored momentum. Once the line cracked, the flow could not be stopped. German Panzer divisions attempted counterattacks near Saint-Lô and later around Mortain. On paper, these formations still looked formidable. In reality, many operated at a fraction of authorized strength. Tanks advanced with limited fuel, crews were exhausted, communications were unreliable, air cover was scarce. American units, by contrast, advanced with logistical confidence. Tank columns moved knowing fuel trucks followed close behind. Recovery vehicles pulled damaged Shermans from the roadside and returned them to service within days. Ammunition was expended freely to suppress resistance. Medical evacuation cleared casualties rapidly, preserving unit cohesion and morale. German commanders recognized the asymmetry immediately. Every German counterattack was a final effort. Every American attack was one of many. At Mortain in early August, German armor struck hard, briefly threatening to disrupt the American advance. But the attack stalled not because of lack of courage, but because it lacked sustainability. Fuel shortages halted tanks. Allied air power, enabled by secure supply bases and uninterrupted sorties, isolated the battlefield. American units absorbed the blow, reinforced and resumed the advance. For German officers, this was the turning point. Not because Mortain failed, but because it revealed that no counterstroke, no matter how well executed, could alter the operational balance. Losses could not be replaced, time could not be recovered, and the enemy's capacity only grew stronger with each passing day. The battlefield had become a one-way equation, and as American armored columns pushed deeper into France, German tank commanders realized that the final reckoning would not occur at a defensive line, but in a closing pocket where logistics, movement, and exhaustion would converge into a single irreversible outcome. By mid-August 1944, German tank commanders were no longer fighting a campaign. They were fighting entropy. The breakout from Normandy had accelerated beyond anything German planners had anticipated. American armored columns advanced not in cautious bounds, but in continuous movement, day and night, because the system behind them allowed it. Fuel arrived, ammunition arrived, replacement vehicles arrived. Units did not pause to recover. Recovery followed them forward. For German armor, movement itself became a liability. Panzer units retreating toward the Seine were forced to abandon tanks not because they were destroyed in combat, but because they ran out of fuel. Crews disabled their own vehicles with explosives or engine damage, then withdrew on foot. Roads filled with burned-out hulks, not the result of a single catastrophic battle, but of logistical exhaustion. This reality reached its starkest expression in the Falaise pocket. As Allied forces closed in from north and south, German commanders attempted to extract what remained of their armored formations. The intention was simple: escape east, regroup, and rebuild. But logistics, once again, dictated the outcome. American and Allied air power dominated the roads because it was supported by uninterrupted fuel, spare parts, and rotating crews. Fighter bombers returned to the battlefield repeatedly, striking columns, bridges, and choke points. German units lacked fuel to disperse, lacked ammunition to fight through, lacked vehicles to evacuate wounded or tow damaged tanks. Inside the pocket, German tank commanders faced an impossible choice: fight and be destroyed, or abandon equipment and survive. Many chose survival. The roads east of Falaise became corridors of wreckage. Panthers and tigers sat immobilized, intact but useless. Supply trucks burned beside them. Horses lay dead among machine parts. The battlefield told a story no propaganda could erase. American forces, advancing cautiously through the aftermath, were struck by what they found. Not defeated enemies, but emptied ones. German armor had not been beaten into submission by superior tanks. It had been starved out by a system that could not keep pace with the enemy's momentum. The loss figures told only part of the story. The true collapse lay in what could no longer be repaired, refueled, or replaced. German tank commanders understood the significance immediately. Normandy was not just a tactical defeat, it was the moment when American logistics transformed operational advantage into strategic certainty. From that point forward, German armored units would fight bravely, skillfully, and often desperately, but always under constraint. Every engagement would begin with shortages already factored in. Every retreat would cost equipment that could never be replaced. The war in the West had crossed a threshold, and beyond it no amount of courage or experience could reverse the arithmetic that now governed every mile of ground. The consequences of that realization would shape how German forces fought and failed through the remainder of 1944.
After Normandy, German tank commanders no longer planned operations around opportunity. They planned around limitation. The retreat across France exposed the full consequences of logistical imbalance. As American forces surged eastward, German armored units attempted to reconstitute behind the Seine, then the Meuse, then the German frontier itself. On paper, divisions still existed. In reality, many were formations in name only, command structures without substance. The material losses were staggering. In the weeks following the Falaise pocket, German forces lost thousands of vehicles. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, artillery pieces left behind because no tractors remained to tow them. Repair units stripped immobilized Panthers and Tigers for spare parts, knowing those parts would never be enough to rebuild full battalions. German records from late summer 1944 reveal a shift in reporting language. Commanders stopped requesting additional equipment in specific numbers. Instead, they asked for anything available. Fuel allocations were measured in days, sometimes hours. Training was reduced to the absolute minimum required to keep crews operational. Meanwhile, American armored formations displayed the opposite pattern. Divisions that had fought continuously since June were rotated, resupplied, and reinforced without leaving the operational theater. Damaged tanks were recovered, repaired, and returned to service within days. Fuel shortages were rare and temporary. Ammunition expenditure was high, but replacement rates matched consumption. This disparity reshaped battlefield psychology. German tank crews entered engagements knowing that losses, any losses, were permanent. An American unit could trade space for time. German units could trade neither. Every destroyed vehicle narrowed future options. Every forced withdrawal reduced operational depth. German officers noted the effect on morale with uncomfortable clarity. Crews fought bravely, but confidence eroded. Tactical success no longer brought relief, only temporary survival. A successful ambush might destroy several Shermans, but the counterattack always came, fully supplied, often stronger than before. The strategic implications were unavoidable. American logistics enabled continuous pressure. There were no pauses long enough for German forces to reorganize meaningfully. No operational breathing room. Even defensive lines, once established, were undermined by the same problem. Fuel shortages limited mobility, ammunition shortages limited endurance, and repair shortages limited recovery. By autumn 1944, German armored doctrine itself began to collapse under logistical strain. Combined arms maneuver, once the hallmark of German warfare, became increasingly difficult to execute. Tank units lacked infantry because transport was unavailable. Infantry lacked artillery support because shells were rationed. Commanders were forced into static defense, not because it was preferred, but because movement had become too expensive. American forces exploited this relentlessly.
When resistance stiffened, they bypassed it. When German units attempted counterattacks, they were detected early by air reconnaissance supported by reliable communications and struck before momentum could build. American logistics turned information into action at a speed German systems could no longer match. For German tank commanders, the lesson of Normandy now extended beyond France. They understood that any future engagement against American forces would unfold under the same conditions: unequal endurance, unequal recovery, unequal time horizons. The war had become asymmetrical, not in weapons, but in sustainability. And that realization set the stage for the final attempts to regain initiative, attempts that would gamble everything on one last effort to break the system before it closed completely.
The final German offensive in the West, the Ardennes attack in December 1944, was conceived under the shadow of everything Normandy had revealed. German tank commanders understood the gamble immediately. The plan depended not on sustained success, but on speed, surprise, and capture. Fuel depots had to be seized intact. American logistics had to be disrupted faster than they could recover. The offensive did not aim to defeat the Allied system, it aimed to shock it into momentary paralysis. Even in its planning, the operation acknowledged German weakness. Panzer units were issued fuel allocations that allowed movement only one way. There were no reserves behind the spearheads. Vehicles advanced knowing that retreat might be impossible. Crews were instructed to salvage fuel from abandoned Allied vehicles as they moved forward. This was not operational confidence, it was logistical desperation. When the offensive stalled, first from fuel shortages, then from weather clearing and Allied air power, the outcome followed the pattern established in Normandy. American forces absorbed the shock, rerouted supplies, and resumed pressure. Damaged roads were repaired, fuel convoys adjusted routes, airfields resumed operations within hours. German armored units, by contrast, became immobilized. Tanks sat silent in forests, engines intact, but fuel tanks empty. Crews abandoned vehicles they could not destroy. Repair units lacked tools, parts, and transport. Once again, loss became permanent. By early 1945, German tank commanders no longer framed their assessments in terms of winning or losing battles. They spoke instead of exhaustion curves: how long men could fight without rest, how long engines could run without oil, how long units could exist without replacement. The answers were increasingly short. American logistics, now operating from fully developed ports and road networks, reached levels of efficiency that German intelligence had once considered impossible. Entire armored divisions repositioned in days. Fuel flowed continuously. Ammunition expenditure rose without restraint. German commanders recognized that Normandy had not been a single revelation, it had been the beginning of an irreversible trend. From that point onward, every engagement reinforced the same truth. American logistics were not simply supporting operations, they were shaping them, dictating tempo, eliminating pauses, removing the opportunity for recovery. By the time German forces retreated into the Reich itself, the shock had faded, replaced by resignation. The system could not be outrun, it could not be outlasted, and it could not be matched. For German tank commanders who had once believed maneuver and precision could overcome any disadvantage, this was the war's final lesson. Skill still mattered, courage still mattered, but without fuel, parts, transport, and replacement, they mattered less each day. Normandy had exposed the imbalance. Everything afterward merely confirmed it. And as the war drew toward its end, those who survived carried that understanding with them, not as ideology, but as professional judgment shaped by experience. That understanding leads directly to the final reflection on what Normandy truly changed, not just for Germany, but for modern warfare itself. The shock German tank commanders felt in Normandy was not the shock of defeat.
It was the shock of irrelevance. For decades, military thought had centered on battlefield decision, on tactics, leadership, and decisive engagements that shattered an enemy's will. Normandy revealed a different truth, one that would define warfare long after the hedgerows fell silent. The war was no longer decided where tanks met tanks. It was decided where fuel was refined, where trucks were assembled, where spare parts were standardized, and where systems were designed to endure loss without collapse. American logistics did not eliminate combat skill, it absorbed it. It made individual failures survivable and individual victories cumulative. Where German doctrine sought decisive moments, American logistics created decisive conditions. Normandy proved that momentum could be manufactured, that endurance could be engineered, that war in the modern age belonged not to the side that fought hardest in a single moment, but to the side that could fight longest without breaking. German tank commanders learned this not from theory, but from experience. From watching enemy units return unchanged after losses that would have ended their own operations. From fighting an opponent whose strength seemed detached from the battlefield itself. That lesson reshaped post-war military thinking across the world. Logistics became strategy. Industry became firepower. Planning for loss became as important as planning for victory. The hedgerows of Normandy did not just witness the defeat of German armor. They marked the moment when modern warfare revealed its true center of gravity. And once revealed, it could never be ignored again.